We are in Isaiah chapter 51. We're about midway through. I'm going to pick up at about verse 17 of chapter 51 as I was looking at that this afternoon, thinking about what we talked about last Wednesday. And so I want to pick up at that point and most likely move through chapter 53 tonight. That was the scheduled plan, and we'll see whether or not we'll be able to complete that. Really, chapter 53 is kind of the most familiar of all this narrative that we're looking at as it kind of points to Jesus and the various things that he will encounter when he eventually comes to be that chosen servant that God had selected. So let's keep working through this narrative, and I want us to notice that he keeps referring to Jesus. We kind of make that conclusion, right? Isaiah wouldn't necessarily what? Yeah, he wouldn't necessarily know exactly who this is. He sees the prophecies. He knows that maybe the time period is relevant to the prophecies that way. He might know certain aspects of what this individual will do and be, but he doesn't know exactly who this is. So within the narrative, he keeps referring to him as the servant, God's chosen servant. He is different. What is the specific difference between Jesus, the chosen servant, and Israel, God's chosen people as servants? What's the difference between those two, generically speaking? Well, let me ask it this way. Did Israel always do what God asked them to do? No. Will the coming servant do exactly what the Father asks him to do? Yes, that's the major contrast between the two. Israel chose at times to ignore what God wanted. The coming servant, Isaiah talks about the fact he'll do exactly what the Father wants, even if it means what? Yeah, suffering the difficulties and challenges and hurt and harm that others may cause. Whatever it is that he has to fulfill, he will fulfill. And so God, through his coming servant, will lead them out of the challenges that his people had really, in many senses, had brought on themselves. And in fact, he'll state that no one among them could even begin to accomplish what the coming servant of God would accomplish. And he speaks about this, and we'll see it here in a minute in the text, but he speaks about this cup of fury that their transgressions had brought on to them, that they had to drink, and within the wrath of God, and some of that imagery. So let's take a look at that narrative itself. Verse 17 of Isaiah chapter 51. He says, "Awake, awake, stand up, O Jerusalem, which hast drunk at the hand of the Lord the cup of his fury. Thou hast drunken the dregs of the cup of trembling and wrung them out. There is none to guide her among all the sons whom she hath brought forth, neither is there any that taketh her by the hand of all the sons that she hath brought up. These two things are come unto thee. Who shall be sorry for thee? Desolation and destruction, and the famine and the sword. By whom shall I comfort thee? Thy sons have fainted. They lie at the head of all the streets as a wild bull in a net. They are full of the fury of the Lord, the rebuke of thy God. And therefore hear now this, thou afflicted and drunken, but not with wine. Thus saith the Lord, thy Lord, the Lord, and thy God that pleadeth the cause of his people. Behold, I have taken out of thy hand the cup of trembling, even the dregs of the cup of my fury, and thou shalt no more drink it again. But I will put it into the hand of them that afflict thee, which have said to thy soul, Bow down, that we may go over, and thou hast laid thy body as the ground and as the street to them that went over." And so it's interesting to think about this interesting kind of description. He talks about this judgment that he had brought to them as them having to do what? Well, what did he say they were having to do? They had to drink the cup of fury, right? They had to drink the cup of fury because of their transgressions and sins and things that they had done against God. What will he eventually do with that cup of fury? Who did he say he's going to give it to? Okay, I'm going to give that to the enemies, he said. Eventually, I'm going to take that cup of fury away from you, that judgment that I have been bringing against you. I'm going to take it out of your hand, and I'm going to give that judgment and challenges over to your enemies and those who have created challenges and difficulties for you. it's interesting when you think about God's judgment and even His wrath at times and the condemnation that He brings because of transgression. And when I think about this concept of them drinking this cup, and that's an interesting word, right? Because when Jesus went to the garden, what did He pray? Yeah, let this cup pass from me. What was He about to do? He's about to go to the cross and die, but what's He going to do? What's He trying to accomplish by that? I'm not trying to... Okay, He's paying the price for transgressions and sins. And it's interesting, right? I don't know whether you can say for 100% positive that there's this connectivity within the language, but it's interesting language. That Jesus would say, let this cup, He's about to, in His body, take on the sins and transgressions of the world. Let this cup, if it be Thy will, let this cup pass from me, but not my will, but Thine be done, right? That's the message of His prayer before the Father, as He's about, in some pictures, to drink the cup of fury because of sin. God made His own people drink that cup. He made the enemies of His people drink that cup. Now His Son, when He comes, when the servant arrives, He will be willing to drink the cup of condemnation on behalf of the transgressors and absorb within His own body the sins and challenges of the people. It's just interesting kind of prophetic words, especially when you think about what Jesus prays in the garden. Now, I suppose somebody could argue, well, no, that's just a kind of a generic idea. This cup meaning just what it is that He's about to endure and take. And I appreciate that. There's a simplistic idea there too, I can understand. But anyway, it just seemed like kind of connective language to me. When here He's talking about the coming servant, and then He talks about the judgment He's brought to His own people and into the enemies, and what this coming servant would do. And within all of this language, this particular vernacular, if you will, has come up within the description. Thoughts or questions up to there?
So in a sense, He's enduring the judgment of God because the penalty for sin is death.
Yeah, he's taking upon Himself, when He goes to the cross, He's taking upon Himself the very consequences that should have been bestowed upon the transgressors, us, but makes a remedy and an answer for the very transgressions that we couldn't answer for ourselves. So jump to chapter 52. So awake, awake, He says at the outset of this chapter. Awake, awake, and put on thy strength, O Zion. Put on thy beautiful garments, O Jerusalem, the holy city. For henceforth there shall no more come into thee the uncircumcised and the unclean. So why is it time to celebrate for those immediate people? We're not talking about the coming servant again yet. Why is there immediate celebration among them? What's God going to do? He's going to comfort them, and He's going to do that by what means, does the text say? Okay, He's going to take the bonds away, and who's not allowed in there anymore? No more come into thee the uncircumcised and the unclean. Who is that? That's the Gentiles. The Gentile world that God had been using to judge them, I'm going to distance them from you, is what the prophet is saying. God is making a promise to them, and it's worth celebrating to know that all of these Gentile conflicts that you've been enduring, I'm going to put all that aside for you. And I'm going to aid you through that process. They had sold themselves into conflict for no benefit. But the text says in verse 3, God is going to redeem them. For thus saith the Lord, you have sold yourselves for naught, and ye shall be redeemed without money. They had made allegiances, they had gone into captivity. All of the things that they had done didn't bring them any benefit, though at times they thought it would. So God says, I'm going to have to redeem you. Generally, the idea of redemption is to take that which was captive and set it free. And so when He says here, I'm going to redeem you, you have been captives. I allowed you to go into captivity. I'm going to bring you out of that. I'm going to redeem you from that and set you free. And it's not going to cost money in order to accomplish that. because God is frustrated with those who He had used for these purposes. And He's going to bring judgment to the people that blasphemed His name rather than honor the one who had given them the victory. Notice verse 5. Now therefore what have I here, saith the Lord, that my people is taken away for naught? They that rule over them make them to howl, saith the Lord, and my name continually every day is blasphemed. Who allowed those enemies to take over God's people to begin with? God did, right? God allowed for that, though they didn't give Him what? They didn't give Him credit for it. They didn't honor God for it. They didn't give credit to Jehovah God for it. Even though there was a period of time where those nations would have cowered in fear over the God that was in control of Israel and those people. But God allowed for them to bring this condemnation and judgment against His own people, and rather than honoring the fact that Jehovah God had permitted and guided that, they became blasphemous, and now they're going to get judged because of it. And we've seen that within Isaiah's writings already before. And eventually, he says, His people will once again know who the Lord is. Verse 6, Therefore my people shall know my name, and therefore they shall know in that day that I am He that doth speak. Behold, it is I. How beautiful upon the mountains are the feet of him that bringeth good tidings, that publisheth peace, that bringeth good tidings of good, that publisheth salvation, that saith unto Zion, Thy God reigneth. What's that sound like? Yeah, that sounds like Romans 10, doesn't it? Let me share one other text with you before we get to Romans 10. It's also similar to what a contemporary had said. Nahum, in Nahum 1:15, says, Behold upon the mountains the feet of him that bringeth good tidings, that publisheth peace. O Judah, keep thy solemn feast, perform thy vows, for the wicked shall no more pass through thee, he is utterly cut off. The same language that Isaiah is using is the same kinds of things that Nahum is saying as well, and then it's similar to what the Apostle Paul had said in Romans 10 verse 15, when he talks about the spread of the gospel. They're not identical, by the way. I don't think Isaiah at that moment is speaking about what Paul was talking about. He's talking about glad tidings for the contemporaries of Isaiah. He's talking about the positive message and the hope and promise that was coming from God to them in the immediate. But Paul uses similar language to talk about the glad tidings that came when the gospel arrived. And he simply said, How shall they preach except they be sent? And as it is written, How beautiful are the feet of them that preach the gospel of peace and bring glad tidings of good things. And so Paul basically borrows from Isaiah and Nahum when he presents this concept of how wonderful it is when folks take the gospel message into the world. He just goes back to Isaiah and Nahum and uses their language, and just as they had declared how wonderful it was that peace had come to God's people and a freedom from that captivity was available to them, and Paul borrows from that language in this text. And then there's an interesting statement, I think anyway, in my study of this, that he makes in verse 8. In Isaiah 52 and verse 8, notice he said, The watchman shall lift up the voice. With the voice together they shall sing, for they shall see eye to eye when the Lord shall bring again Zion. If I'm reading that right, who are they seeing eye to eye with? I'll ask you first. I got all night. Who are they? Who they shall see eye to eye. Who with whom? Okay, maybe their enemy. That's possible. Well, let me ask you this, because you knew better to think that I could stand here all night. You're smarter than that. You know me too well. Who had they not been seeing eye to eye with up until the return after the captivity? God. Right? What's it? Say it again. Yeah. Right. There was a disconnect, right, between them and some of the exiles, and in particular with their relationship with the Creator. But now there'll be harmony among all these things. They'll see eye to eye when it comes. They'll view what needs to be declared, and because that's the comments that just preceded this, they'll agree. The challenge the people had was you'd have one prophet come and he would say, God said this, and then the next prophet would come and what would he do? Yeah, God said that, right? They'd just say the opposite. And it challenged the people, and eventually they just kind of picked and chose who they wanted to listen to, rather than honoring the legitimate messages that were coming to God. When this return happens, I think he's talking about the idea that harmony returns. When you see eye to eye with the Lord, good things happen. When I struggle with my faith, when I struggle with my different challenges in life, generally the reason for that is the Lord and I aren't seeing eye to eye. We're not in agreement. I want to view something differently than the Lord has described. I want to behave in a different way than the Lord has permitted. I'm not in this harmonious connectivity between myself and God. One of the benefits that's going to come to the people upon the return is they're going to begin to have those in leadership position, the watchmen, those who are watching out for them, will start seeing eye to eye, and in particular, will start seeing eye to eye with the Lord. And that brought them benefit and would bring us benefit when we do that. And we're challenged just as they were when we don't see eye to eye.
God has always wanted to be His people's God and His people be His people.
He wants connectivity between them. So verse 9 says, break forth into joy, sing together, you waste places of Jerusalem, for the Lord hath comforted His people, He hath redeemed Jerusalem. Just an interesting piece of historical narrative maybe for us, but something we can learn from. Generally, all of their celebratory moments included what throughout the history of the people? And I'm not trying to trick you, it's right in the verse. Singing. Singing. When they crossed through the Red Sea in safety, what did they do after that? They sang. And when Paul and Silas are imprisoned, but they know they're being strengthened through Jehovah, they're singing, praying and singing. Right? Singing is a celebratory thing. And I only say that just to give us food for thought. We have psalms and hymns and spiritual songs, right? And they're different. They're different in their messaging, and not that they say unscriptural things. That's not what I mean by that. But I just mean in the manner in which they deliver the message. They're different. But I think we can learn something from God's people that on many occasions their singing was celebratory. They were singing the praises. You know, sometimes we talk about we're going to sing the praises of Jehovah. Well, I think that singing the praises of Jehovah isn't just about picking the right word. It's also about the intent and inflection of the heart that comes out of that. Singing should be celebratory in praise to God. Yeah. And I think that we can appreciate this long-standing history of God's people that used singing praises as a means to celebrate their appreciation for what God had done. And I think it's a valuable lesson. And as Bill pointed out, it's a New Testament concept as well.
Concept in Isaiah 14 when it talks about their rest and peace, and they break into singing.
Yeah. And there are various moments where he references the idea of singing in those texts, in the peace and the comfort and the rest that would come. Yeah.
No, Jerusalem's in ruins at this time.
Yeah.
But they're
Earlier.
They're back home.
Yeah, when he's talking about when they return and come, And just the idea that they're allowed to return should be worthy of celebration, even before they restore the temple and all the things necessary that needs to be rebuilt, the wall and other aspects. And then he makes an interesting statement in verse 12. For ye shall not go out with haste, nor go by flight, for the Lord will go before you, and the God of Israel will be your I can't even say that word. Never mind. I'll never say it right. Say that. Reward. Hey, it came out. Barely. But what I want us to appreciate. So, let me back you up for a minute. Last time they were in captivity was where? Egypt, right? And when he comes out of Egypt, they went in a dead sprint towards the promised land. No, that's not right, is it? That's not right at all. God, in fact, didn't take them in a direct path. They were going to need time to be able to gather themselves properly and prepare themselves properly for what was lying ahead. Now we know there's all kinds of history that unfolds in between those moments. I see the same thing here. God says, when I bring you out of captivity, you're not going to come out of captivity in a dead sprint right back. It's going to be a process, and it's going to take time. In fact, we know that some come back, right? There's a first wave, and then there's another primary wave that comes. Not everybody returns initially. And God says, I'm going to be with you throughout the whole process. I'm going to walk before you and lead you back in to this situation. Generally, when we struggle, again, in our own personal relationship with God, generally it's because we get out in front of Him, right? If I'm out in front of God, can I see Him? And I'm not trying to trick you. I'm just trying to think about it. No, I can't, right? I'm out in front. No, then it's hard to take His guidance. It's hard to follow Him. God says, I'll get you back, but you're going to have to let me go where? I got to be in front. In our walk with the Creator, we got to let God be in the front. He's got to be the one out in front of us and guiding us and leading us. And if we're trying to be in front of the Lord, it's not going to be to our benefit.
Your reward is rear guard.
Yeah. And that's an imagery, and that was a word that just, yeah. And maybe the idea then is a greater sense than I even described, and that is that He's both. He's out in front and He's protecting. I think probably that's the idea, that He's leading from the front, He's protecting them from behind. And again, go back to the Egyptian imagery of the pursuing armies of Egypt. And so the protection needed to come from behind, while God, through Moses, was leading them from the front. And so I think you probably do see both of those imageries there. At the end of chapter 52, trying to look at the clock for half a second here, but let me just think with you for a minute. So here's further references to this coming servant. And he talks about the prudence and wisdom that he would have to accomplish God's purposes. Notice verse 13. Behold, my servant shall deal prudently. He shall be exalted and extolled and be very high. When Jesus comes, when this servant arrives, there will be great wisdom and measured purpose behind what He does. New Testament writers talk about the fact that he grows, right, in favor of men and in the favor of God. There's a maturity process that even Jesus the Savior goes through, and a wisdom that is gained that ultimately will be respected. And many in His day would be amazed that one who could become so physically marred could be the one that could ultimately deliver them the benefits and blessings that God intended. Just keep reading. As many were astonished at thee, his visage was so marred, more than any man, and his form more than the sons of men. So shall he sprinkle many nations. The kings shall shut their mouths at him, for that which had not been told them shall they see, and that which they had not heard shall they consider. It will be astonishing to people. They will be amazed at how someone who could go through such physical brutality could still be wiser than any other leader and any other guidance that somebody could have brought into the equation. I really think end of chapter 52 really belongs with the beginning of chapter 53, by the way, because he continues the thought. So Isaiah gives this imagery of this one who's going to be marred and challenged physically, but still has the prestige and prominence of a greater king than the world had seen. And then he makes that statement in verse 1 of chapter 53. Who's going to believe this? That's kind of what Isaiah is saying. Who hath believed our report, and to whom is the arm of the Lord revealed? Isaiah is concerned, right? He's not sure anybody's going to believe any of these things he's talking about. How is any of this possible? It goes against all the human thoughts and processes that people would generally consider. So he's not so sure that anyone's even going to believe that this one could serve those purposes. Now just read with me. Why is that a concern? Well, because he shall grow up before him as a tender plant, as a root out of a dry ground. He hath no form nor comeliness. When we shall see him, there is no beauty that we should desire him. People being attracted to human beauty has been around forever. It's not a new concept. It's not a 2023 concept. Now, men's definition of beauty at times has changed throughout history, and depending on what culture you happen to be in, people will view it differently. But it's a concept that just about every culture has a form of. And I say that only to illustrate to you that when Isaiah writes about this coming servant, this great king, this Lord of Lords, this one who's going to produce all this benefit, the one who should be exalted and extolled above all others, he's not going to look like your typical influential person. He's not going to have the appearance that most had. We can point to which king under the Old Testament system that kind of identifies with that. What was said about Saul when he was chosen? He was head and shoulders above all the others. His beauty, right? The way he looked. Everybody just would look at him and go, that's a king. Right? You would look at Jesus and he would look like what? He looked like everybody else. He will blend in. He's not going to stand out for anything physical about him. He's going to blend in. There's no form nor comeliness about him when we shall see him. There's no beauty that we should desire him to see or hand.
Remember they asked the question, is this Joseph the carpenter's son? I think that's part of what was behind that question is this carpenter's son is what we're looking for?
Yeah, Isaiah is concerned that nobody will believe him when he prophesies concerning it, and the followers of Jesus were concerned that people were ignoring him in his own day because they just couldn't bring themselves to believe that this was actually the one they had been waiting for. Pause for a quick moment here. Any reason you could think of why that's important? That he doesn't have just a natural beauty or physicality about him that just naturally draws people to him? Yeah, he wants to be followed for the right reasons. Yeah. Right. The character in which he would come, the form in which he would come in was not going to be the power and strength of a great earthly king. It was going to be the form of a servant. And from the way he looked, his physical presence, and ultimately he wanted people to come to him not because of the way he looked or anything physical, but by what he says, by the message that he presents. That's what he wants people to come to appreciate, and not necessarily anything physical about him. Yeah, go ahead, Bob.
When you're a kid and you do something wrong, you don't want to look at your dad.
Yeah.
And this was the feeling that I got from that verse, that they didn't want to look at the servant.
Yeah. And that could be some of this imagery here. And certainly, verse 3 says, he'll be despised, rejected of men, a man of sorrows and acquainted with grief. I don't know how to say this without it sounding, I don't want to sound flippant, but I want to get the imagery. There's nothing exciting, right? Some people you like to be around just because they're fun, right? They're just fun to be around. They've got a ball of energy or whatever it is. But he's despised and rejected because he's a man of sorrows. He's acquainted with grief. And we hid as it were our face from him. He was despised. And we what? We esteemed him not. He was worthy of somebody standing up for him. But nobody did. As he was being despised and rejected of men, though he was acquainted with grief and sorrow and was deserved of comfort and compassion, he received none. And let me add this thought that when I was reading through this again today kind of struck me. It's interesting that the prophet uses what pronoun there? Not to challenge your English knowledge here. We. You notice that? How is Isaiah saying we? Yeah. It just kind of struck me that Isaiah is writing it, and he's talking about what he will be, but notice he's despised and rejected of men, a man of sorrows, acquainted with grief, and we hid, as it were, our faces from him. He was despised, and we esteemed him not. And I think really what the prophet's trying to get maybe folks to appreciate is he just finished talking to the immediate contemporaries that would ultimately be allowed to come home out of captivity and come back into the promised land, and they should sing the praises of God for that. They should exalt God's name, and they should bring praise to him because of all this comfort and all this benefit that's coming. And then he turns and talks about the glory that the coming servant would bring. That should have been a moment of celebration. But rather it was a moment of despising and rejecting. And I think Isaiah is saying we as a nation, we as the people of God who were protected and given this benefit to allow for Jesus to ultimately arrive, the only reason God spared them was to fulfill his promises to allow Jesus to arrive. Jesus arrives and we rejected him. Isaiah is just driving home here this sad reality of how the people just continually turned away from what God was doing for them. And he even allows their existence to continue to bring about Jesus. Their whole reason they were still a nation was to bring about this coming servant, and when the servant arrived, they turned their backs to him, and they hid their face. Even though surely he hath borne our griefs, he carried our, Isaiah is including himself in the language. Surely he hath borne our griefs and carried our sorrows. Yet we did esteem him stricken, smitten of God, and afflicted. He did this for whose benefit? Ours. Why I wanted us to emphasize that with Isaiah, because I think we need to emphasize that idea with us. We sometimes hide our face from Jesus. We sometimes don't want to look. And as Bob mentioned a little while ago, the idea that we don't want the obligations of having to look upon him. And the challenges that might bring to us. We considered him stricken, smitten of God, and afflicted, even though he did all those things for our benefit and carried our sorrows. And we just kind of said, well, God must be doing that to him. That's what they said. He was wounded for our, there's that word again, transgressions. He was bruised for our iniquities. The chastisement of our peace was upon him, and with his stripes we are healed. He suffered all of those things because of what we had done. Our transgressions. He faced the difficulties and was bruised for our iniquities. The chastisement of our peace was upon him. And with his stripes we are healed. What I love about what Isaiah is trying to convey, and I should say, well, God is conveying through the prophet Isaiah, is he wants all men to include themselves in what Jesus, the coming servant, is going to accomplish. Put yourself in that situation, he says, because he did this for our transgressions. This was our iniquities that caused this, our chastisement. We were responsible for this. By his stripes we are healed. All we, like sheep, have gone astray. We have turned every one to his own way, and the Lord hath laid on him the iniquity of us all. We turned away from Jesus. We turned away from God. We turned towards the transgressions and sins of the world. He laid that iniquity on the coming servant. Who had God laid that iniquity on prior to that? Well, what's Isaiah? What's the entire book of Isaiah been about? The judgment of God against whom? On everyone, right? Yeah. And the consequences and difficulties and judgments that would come. He's been talking about all these nations, and when they stepped outside of God's will, he punished his own people when they transgressed. He brought their iniquities upon their own. In fact, he'll say that your transgressions have caused this. Your iniquities have brought this. That all changes when the coming servant arrives. When he placed all that guilt upon these nations, he's saying, even though we were responsible, even though we like sheep have gone astray, we have turned every one of us in our own way. And yet the Lord has taken and laid our iniquities onto Jesus. He's letting him drink the cup of fury on behalf of all those who would come to know forgiveness and salvation and hope in the Savior. The coming servant came to provide for us what we could not provide for ourselves. And if God just simply dealt with us as he did with those other nations, then we would all just face the consequence. We just have to face the judgment of God. And yet through the coming servant, through Jesus, we have remission of sins, an answer to this iniquity. And God allows for him to bear the challenge and difficulties that we had brought on because of sin. He was taken from prison and from judgment. Who shall declare his generation? For he was cut off out of the land of the living. For the transgression of my people was he stricken. He made his grave with the wicked and with the rich in his death, right? He dies with whom? To what? To common criminals, right? 2 malefactors. But he's buried where? Yeah, tomb of Joseph of Arimathea, who was wealthy enough to have his own private tomb hewn out of stone, out of the rock formation. It'll be an evidence that Jesus is exactly this servant that Isaiah spoke of. And though he had done no violence, no deceit in his mouth, and yet it pleased the Lord to bruise him. He hath put him to grief. When thou shalt make his soul an offering for sin, he shall see his seed, he shall prolong his days, and the pleasure of the Lord shall prosper in his hand. He shall see of the travail of his soul, and shall be satisfied. By his knowledge shall my righteous servant justify many, for he shall bear their iniquities. That's what the coming servant will do, that no one else could do, and that no one else could accomplish or fulfill. And that's all that Jesus, the only one, could fulfill and complete, and all of the difficulties that he was willing to endure in order to accomplish it. Maybe come back for half a minute on that next Wednesday. We have a couple more Wednesdays left in our study. We want to briefly maybe come back to this and just allow for extra thoughts, and then we want to move into that last section of the prophecy from chapters 44 through 66 through the end, and begin to wrap up the things that Isaiah shares in his narrative.
The Old Testament law required that they offer the lamb as a sacrifice,
Yeah.
and now we see the
Yeah,
sacrifice
absolutely.
of Jesus for men
Yeah.
in this contrast.
And they had seen and witnessed that for generations. And ultimately the sacrifice of Jesus will take the place. And it's amazing how they never, I shouldn't say none, but many of them never make the connection.